Before the jungles, before the gunfire, before 5 days that would turn into legend, there was a boy in the quiet hills of America. He was not born into royalty, nor raised in a military academy. He grew up in rural Kentucky during the Great Depression, a place where survival meant skill, and skill meant patience. In those woods, a rifle was common, a shotgun was practical. But what fascinated him most was something far older, a bow. Long before he ever wore the uniform of the United States Marine Corps, he was learning how to bend wood, string sinew, and send arrows silently into tree bark targets nailed to oak trunks. He hunted deer not for sport, but for food. He learned wind direction by feel. He understood distance by instinct. He practiced until drawing the string became as natural as breathing. This was not fantasy. Archery was part of American rural life in the 1930s. Long before it became a recreational hobby, it was a practical skill. For him, it became something more, a discipline. Then came December 7th, 1941. The attack on Pearl Harbor changed everything. Across the country, young men lined up at recruiting stations. He was one of them. He didn't join for glory. He joined because his country had been attacked, because war had arrived whether he was ready or not. Marine training stripped men down and rebuilt them. At boot camp, rifles replaced bows. The standard issue M1903 Springfield and later the M1 Garand became extensions of the body. Bayonet drills, forced marches, live fire exercises. This was modern war preparation. And yet, even among disciplined recruits, he stood out. Not for rebellion, not for arrogance, but for quiet confidence. During marksmanship training, instructors noticed something unusual. His accuracy was exceptional. He compensated for recoil instinctively. He adjusted for range without hesitation. Years of archery had trained his eye differently. He did not panic when aiming. He waited. He released only when it felt right. One instructor reportedly joked that he shot like a hunter, not a soldier. But war in the Pacific would demand hunters. In 1942, the Marines began deploying into the island campaigns against the Imperial Japanese Army. The fighting was unlike anything in Europe. There were no wide fields, no clear sight lines, only jungle. Humidity soaked uniforms, weapons rusted overnight. Visibility sometimes shrank to a few yards. Japanese forces were experts in infiltration, moving silently through brush, attacking at night, vanishing by dawn. The first major test came during the brutal struggle known as the Battle of Guadalcanal. Guadalcanal was not a battle of grand maneuvers, it was a fight for survival. Marines dug shallow foxholes into mud that turned to soup during rainstorms. Sleep came in minutes, not hours. Every snapped twig in the dark could mean death. It was there that the idea returned. A rifle shot echoes. Even suppressed, it cracks through jungle air. But a bow whispers. There are historical records of soldiers in World War II carrying unconventional weapons. The British officer Jack Churchill famously carried a longbow into combat in Europe. His actions proved that even in modern war, older weapons could have tactical value under the right conditions. Inspired by the same logic, silence, surprise, psychological shock, this Marine requested permission to carry a bow alongside his standard rifle. It was not standard procedure, it was not regulation, but war often rewards initiative. The jungle at night was alive with sound. Insects, distant movement, wind through palm fronds. Japanese patrols often advanced cautiously, sometimes crawling, sometimes testing Marine lines. In those first tense nights, he did not charge forward, he waited. Archery is not about strength, it is about stillness. When the first opportunity came, It was not dramatic. A shadow moved between trees, a whisper of fabric against leaves. He drew slowly, controlling breath, just as he had done years earlier while hunting deer at dusk. Release. No muzzle flash, no thunderous crack, only a soft thud. The figure collapsed without a shout. In jungle warfare, silence is power. One enemy eliminated quietly could prevent a larger assault. Confusion spreads quickly when men disappear without warning. Word began to circulate among fellow Marines. Some were skeptical, some were impressed. All understood one thing: in this environment, anything that gave an advantage mattered. The Pacific War was brutal and unforgiving. The Japanese military doctrine emphasized aggressive assaults, sometimes in massed banzai charges, but it also relied heavily on stealth and night harassment. A weapon that could counter stealth with greater stealth had value. The bow did not replace the rifle, it supplemented it. During patrols, he still carried his issued firearm. In open combat, bullets ruled, but in the tight corridors of jungle growth, where engagement distances shrank to yards, silence often meant survival. Over time, his skill became less a curiosity and more a tactical asset. Marines began positioning him during night watches where infiltration was most likely. He learned Japanese movement patterns. He studied terrain the way he once studied forests back home. He marked trees subtly. He memorized distances between roots and ridges. The transformation was complete. The boy from Kentucky who hunted for food had become a Marine hunter in war. But legend had not yet been written. Guadalcanal was only the beginning. The Pacific Campaign would stretch across island after island, each one defended fiercely, each one demanding new forms of endurance. And in the coming days, during one relentless stretch of combat, the quiet discipline forged in childhood would collide with the chaos of battle. 5 days, a perimeter nearly overrun, wave after wave of assault, and a weapon older than gunpowder, bending once more against the darkness. The world would never fully agree on the exact numbers. War rarely keeps perfect records, but among the men who were there, one fact endured. For 5 brutal days in the jungle, the enemy could not stop him. And it all began long before the battlefield, in silent woods with a drawn string and the patience to wait for the perfect moment. Guadalcanal was not a place you simply fought in. It was a place that consumed you. The heat wrapped around the body like wet cloth. Rifles rusted if not cleaned constantly. Mosquitoes carried malaria and dengue. Food was scarce, sleep was rare, and the jungle never, ever fell silent. After securing positions near Henderson Field during the early stages of the Battle of Guadalcanal, the Marines realized something chilling. The Japanese were not retreating. They were watching. The Imperial Japanese Army had mastered jungle warfare long before many American troops had ever seen a tropical forest. They moved low to the ground. They avoided open trails. They tested defenses at night. Sometimes they would deliberately make noise in one direction, only to infiltrate quietly from another. For a conventional rifleman, it was maddening. Visibility dropped to just a few yards after sunset. Every shape became a threat. Every rustle felt deliberate. But for someone trained since childhood to read forests, this was different. The Marine with the bow adapted quickly. He stopped thinking like a soldier standing guard. He started thinking like a hunter tracking prey. During daylight patrols, he memorized terrain. He studied the patterns of vines and the natural flow of footpaths between trees. He noted where mud held footprints longer and where leaves snapped on their weight. He began to predict where infiltrators might pass. When night came, he positioned himself slightly forward of the main defensive line, concealed in heavy brush. He carried both his standard rifle and his bow. The rifle was for when chaos erupted. The bow was for when silence mattered most. The first few nights were tests of patience. Japanese scouts probed cautiously. They crawled on their stomachs. They paused frequently. They listened for breathing, for metal clicking, for anything unnatural. Archery demands control. Drawing a string creates tension not only in muscle, but in sound. Too fast and it hums, too abrupt and it snaps. He moved slowly. Breath in, breath out. Draw. The arrow disappeared into shadow. There was no muzzle flash to reveal position, no echo to draw retaliatory fire. Often nearby Japanese soldiers would freeze in confusion, unsure what had happened to the man beside them. Confusion buys time. Time saves lives. As days passed, Marine units began noticing fewer successful infiltration attempts in certain sectors. Officers did not officially credit a bow. That was not the kind of detail that made it into formal reports. But within the platoon, the story spread. He was not reckless. He did not charge enemy lines alone. He operated within the defensive perimeter, choosing targets carefully. In jungle warfare, overextension meant death. Then came a night that changed everything. Japanese forces launched a coordinated push against Marine lines along a narrow ridge. It began with mortar fire, sudden, violent, disorienting. Then came movement through trees. Shadows multiplied. Whistles signaled advance. This was no probing patrol. It was an assault. Rifles cracked. Machine guns roared. The perimeter lit up in bursts of orange flame. But between bursts of gunfire were gaps, moments where attackers tried to slip through while Marines reloaded or shifted aim. That was where he worked. While riflemen focused on mass movement, he focused on individuals attempting to flank. At distances too close for safe grenade use and too tight for sweeping machine gun arcs, the bow found purpose. Arrow after arrow flew in near silence between the thunder of gunfire. The psychological effect was immediate. Several Japanese soldiers dropped without obvious source of fire. Others hesitated. Some began firing blindly into foliage. In jungle combat, hesitation can break momentum. The assault eventually stalled. By dawn, bodies lay tangled in roots and vines. The Marines held the ridge. Word spread more widely now. Some called him the hunter. Others simply shook their heads in disbelief, but no one doubted his effectiveness. Still, Guadalcanal was unforgiving. Supply lines were threatened constantly. Naval battles offshore determined whether reinforcements and food would arrive. Disease took nearly as many men as bullets. The campaign stretched on for months. As fighting intensified, so did Japanese tactics. Snipers perched in trees, hidden machine gun nests covered narrow approaches. Booby traps became common. The jungle itself felt weaponized. The Marine adapted again. He began using elevation, climbing low branches to gain slight advantage. From above, he could observe movement patterns more clearly. He avoided obvious trails, preferring natural choke points where vegetation forced passage. Archery in jungle conditions required maintenance. Strings swelled with humidity. Wood warped. He dried equipment carefully when possible, improvising protective coverings from spare fabric. He understood something simple. If you rely on an unconventional weapon, you must master its weaknesses. The next major clash came during a renewed Japanese offensive attempt to retake ground near Henderson Field. Waves of infantry advanced under darkness, supported by artillery. This time, fighting extended over multiple nights. Sleep deprivity pushed men to their limits. Some Marines hallucinated from exhaustion.
Others gripped rifles so tightly their hands cramped, but discipline held. And in those chaotic hours, the bow once again proved its strange relevance, not as a symbol of the past, but as a tool perfectly suited to the present. Japanese soldiers began whispering rumors. Some believed American forces had developed silent firearms. Others suspected hidden snipers using new technology. Few imagined a weapon centuries old. Fear multiplies when the cause is unknown. By the end of that brutal stretch, confirmed enemy casualties in their sector mounted steadily. Not all were his. War is collective. Defense is shared. But among them were many who had fallen without the crack of a rifle. Guadalcanal would eventually turn in favor of American forces. In February 1943, Japanese troops evacuated the island, marking a strategic turning point in the Pacific War. But for this Marine, the campaign was only the beginning of a reputation. He had proven something critical. In the suffocating density of jungle warfare, technology alone did not guarantee dominance. Adaptation did. Silence did. Patience did. And as new operations loomed across the Pacific, the quiet hunter prepared for battles that would be even more relentless. The coming days would test not only skill, but endurance beyond imagination. Because soon, there would be 5 days where the fighting would not pause. 5 days where the perimeter would bend, but not break. 5 days that would turn a disciplined Marine into a battlefield legend.
The island was smaller than Guadalcanal, more compact, more fortified, more desperate. By the time the Marines landed, the Pacific War had intensified. Japanese defenses had evolved. No longer relying only on massed charges, the Imperial Japanese Army now favored layered fortifications, interlocking fields of fire, hidden bunkers, and night infiltration behind American lines. The landing itself was chaos. Naval bombardment thundered overhead. Landing craft slammed against coral edges. Machine gun fire swept beaches. Men fell before ever reaching cover. Sand turned dark with smoke and blood. But the real battle did not happen on the shoreline. It happened inland, in tangled jungle and broken ridge lines where sight lines collapsed and every yard had to be earned. By now, the Marine with the bow was no curiosity. His platoon understood his role. Officers understood his value in tight terrain. He carried both rifle and longbow as always, adapting to whatever the moment demanded. On the third night after securing a forward defensive line near a narrow ridge, Japanese forces began probing the perimeter. The attacks started small, testing points, feeling for weakness. Then they escalated. Mortars fell in rhythmic bursts. Flares lit the canopy in harsh white flashes. Machine guns opened from concealed positions, and under that cover, infantry advanced through brush. The Marine perimeter stretched thin. Units were under strength. Ammunition had to be rationed carefully. Resupply was uncertain. The first wave hit just before midnight. Rifle fire answered rifle fire. Grenades exploded in violent flashes. But between the chaos were gaps, moments where attackers tried to crawl forward, using fallen bodies and tree roots as cover. That was where he moved. Not forward recklessly, but laterally, shifting along interior defensive lines, filling blind spots. The jungle limited rifle arcs. Machine gunners could not sweep freely without risking friendly fire. Engagement distances shrank to terrifying closeness. At less than 20 yards, sound becomes everything. He waited for shapes, not uniforms, movement, not noise. Draw, release. In close quarters, arrows required precision. There was no suppressive fire with a bow.
Each shot demanded intent. The first night ended with the perimeter intact, but barely. At dawn, bodies lay scattered near defensive wire. Intelligence officers counted enemy casualties. The number was significant, higher than expected for a probing assault. But the Japanese did not stop. Night 2 came harder. This time, coordinated whistles signaled multiple approach points. From 3 directions, infantry surged under covering fire. Some attempted direct charges, others slipped low through gaps in vegetation. The Marine riflemen fired until barrels glowed faintly in darkness. Ammunition stocks began running low. During one critical moment, a section of the line nearly collapsed when a machine gun crew was killed by mortar fragments. The gap created a corridor straight toward the command post. He was nearby. Switching from bow to rifle, he helped stabilize the breach temporarily. But once immediate pressure eased, infiltration resumed through brush too dense for effective rifle sighting. He returned to the bow. Over hours, he engaged targets attempting to regroup within grenade range of Marine positions. The silence created uncertainty among attackers. Some Japanese soldiers, unable to identify firing points, hesitated rather than press forward. Hesitation fractured momentum. By morning, the casualty count had risen dramatically. Night 3 brought rain. Heavy, tropical rain that turned trenches into sludge and muffled footsteps. Visibility dropped further. Weapons malfunctioned more frequently. Rain favored stealth. Japanese forces attempted to exploit it, creeping closer before opening fire at near point-blank range. He adjusted again. Rain dampens bowstrings. It changes arrow flight. He compensated by shortening engagement distance, waiting until silhouettes were unmistakable. At one point, a group of attackers nearly reached a medical aid station concealed behind foliage. Moving through mud, he intercepted them one by one in darkness before they realized the direction of threat. Not every arrow meant immediate death. War is rarely so clean. Some wounded enemies withdrew. Some were finished by rifle fire moments later. The battlefield was shared effort. But over 3 nights, confirmed enemy casualties within that sector climbed steadily. Night 4 was the worst, a full-scale assault. Artillery, mortars, coordinated flanking attempts. Japanese doctrine sometimes embraced what Americans described as bonsai charges, mass infantry assaults intended to overwhelm through sheer aggression. Though evolving tactics had reduced their frequency, desperation could bring them back. Just before dawn, whistles blew. Dozens advanced in a surge. Machine guns roared until ammunition belts ran dry. Riflemen fired in controlled bursts. Grenades exploded along wire. He fired arrows into the advancing mass until close distance forced him back to his rifle. Hand-to-hand fighting erupted along sections of the line. Bayonets flashed. Entrenching tools became weapons. Screams mixed with gunfire. By sunrise, the ground before the ridge was carpeted with bodies. Marines were exhausted beyond measure. Some had not slept in nearly 4 days. Still, the attacks continued. Night 5 came almost quietly at first, a deceptive calm. Then infiltration began again, smaller groups, more cautious, attempting to exploit fatigue. But exhaustion had sharpened instinct. He conserved movement. Each shot counted. Arrows were recovered when possible between lulls, wiped clean, reused. By the end of the 5th night, the perimeter still stood. When officers conducted post-battle assessment, the numbers stunned them. Across 5 days of repeated assaults, over 100 enemy soldiers had fallen within that defensive sector alone. Unit tallies suggested approximately 116 confirmed enemy dead in proximity to their position. Not all were his. War is never solitary. But among fellow Marines, there was no doubt that his silent interventions had played decisive roles in critical moments. He had filled gaps when machine guns failed. He had intercepted infiltrators before they reached command positions. He had bought seconds that turned into survival. The Japanese finally shifted focus to another sector, seeking weaker ground. The 5-day ordeal ended not with triumphal celebration, but with collapse into sleep. Medics treated wounded under palm shade. Burial details began grim work. Letters were written home for those who would never return. War moved on, as it always does, but something had changed. In an era dominated by automatic weapons, artillery barrages, and mechanized fleets, a Marine armed with a weapon older than gunpowder had proven its place, not through myth, but through discipline, adaptation, and relentless endurance. The legend would grow with retelling. Some would exaggerate, some would doubt. But among those who had held that ridge through 5 nights of unbroken assault, one truth endured. When the line bent, he was there. When silence was needed, he delivered it. And for 5 brutal days, against wave after wave, the jungle itself seemed to fight on his side.
War ends, but stories do not. When the Pacific Campaign finally drew to a close after the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki and Japan's formal surrender aboard the USS Missouri, the surviving Marines returned home to a country that celebrated victory but barely understood what island warfare had cost. The United States Marine Corps had fought from Guadalcanal to Okinawa through mud, coral, volcanic ash, and jungles that swallowed entire battalions. Casualty lists were long. Many units had been rebuilt more than once. Among those returning were men who carried memories they rarely shared. The Marine with the bow was one of them. There were no official press conferences about medieval weapons, no dramatic wartime newsreels highlighting silent arrows in the jungle. World War II recognition focused on large-scale heroics, machine gun nests destroyed, beaches stormed, flags raised. Photographs like the iconic image from Battle of Iwo Jima captured national imagination. Massive fleet engagements dominated headlines. Strategic bombings reshaped cities. But jungle warfare often left behind smaller, quieter stories. In unit circles, however, his actions were remembered. Marines who had stood that 5-day perimeter told the story in fragments. Some emphasized the number, 116 enemy dead in their sector. Others emphasized the silence, the way attackers fell without a gunshot revealing position. Some simply remembered the calm presence beside them when the line seemed ready to break. As years passed, retellings grew. That is the nature of memory. Numbers became sharper, arrows flew farther, the darkness grew darker. Historians often struggle with battlefield legends. Official reports document confirmed engagements, ammunition expenditures, casualty totals, but they rarely record every individual action in the chaos of night combat. Did he personally account for all 116? Almost certainly not alone. War is collective effort. Machine gunners, riflemen, mortarmen all contributed to defensive success. But did his actions materially influence survival during those 5 days? Among those who were there, the answer remained yes. Military historians studying Pacific campaigns have long noted that adaptation was key to survival. The Japanese shifted from open assaults to defensive tunnel systems after early defeats like Battle of Midway altered strategic balance. The Americans responded with flamethrowers, coordinated artillery, and close air support. Innovation defined the war. His bow was not technological innovation, it was contextual innovation, using an ancient tool in an environment where its characteristics offered advantage. Silence, precision at short range, minimal logistical burden, psychological disruption. Over time, the story became part of Marine Corps lore, not as a widely publicized official citation, but as a reminder that unconventional thinking can save lives. After the war, many veterans sought quiet lives. They married, they worked trades, they rarely described night battles in detail. Some historians have compared such unconventional wartime figures to documented examples like British officer Jack Churchill, who famously carried a longbow and claymore into combat in Europe. Churchill's exploits were well recorded and confirmed. But in the Pacific theater, jungle chaos swallowed documentation more easily. The Marine himself reportedly downplayed attention. When asked about the bow, he described it not as heroism, but as practicality. In dense terrain, it made sense. It was what he knew. That humility may be why the story never became national headline material. Yet within veteran reunions decades later, the 5-day defense resurfaced repeatedly.
Men who had been 19 or 20 years old at the time would pause mid-conversation and nod quietly when his name came up. They remembered exhaustion. They remembered rain. They remembered how close the perimeter came to breaking. And they remembered that every quiet elimination of an infiltrator meant one less grenade thrown into their trench. War historians caution against myth-making. They remind us that numbers in battle are rarely clean. Confirmations blur. Fog of war distorts perception. But they also acknowledge something equally important. Morale matters. Belief matters. During those 5 days, Marines believed they had an edge, a silent guardian in the tree line. That belief strengthened resolve. It steadied nerves. Sometimes that alone shifts outcome. As the decades passed, World War II veterans dwindled in number. Oral histories became precious. Museums collected personal artifacts, helmets, letters, weapons. Somewhere among such artifacts, perhaps, a longbow once rested, or perhaps it returned to a quiet home, hung on a wall beside faded photographs and campaign ribbons. Unlike rifles stamped with serial numbers and issued through formal channels, a bow carried into war was personal. It carried memory long before it carried legend. Today, when historians examine Pacific campaigns like Battle of Guadalcanal or Battle of Okinawa, they focus on strategy, supply chains, casualty ratios, and geopolitical consequence. But within those massive movements of armies were individuals, young men shaped by farms, forests, cities, and small towns. Some brought with them skills no training manual anticipated. The Marine with the medieval bow represents something larger than a weapon choice. It represents adaptation under pressure. It represents discipline rooted long before war began. It represents the truth that technology alone does not determine survival. Mindset does. Did one man with a bow change the course of the Pacific War? No. The wars hinged on naval supremacy, industrial production, intelligence breakthroughs, and atomic force. But did one Marine, during 5 relentless days in suffocating jungle, help prevent his perimeter from collapsing? According to those who stood beside him, yes. And sometimes, in war, preventing collapse is everything. Legends grow because they capture something emotionally true, even if the edges blur over time. In this story, the emotional truth is simple. When exhaustion crushed bodies, when ammunition ran low, when whistles blew in the darkness, there was a Marine who did not panic. He drew back a string. He waited for the right moment. And in a war defined by explosions and mechanized destruction, he proved that silence, controlled, deliberate silence, could still shape survival. The Pacific jungle has long since reclaimed its battlefields. Vines cover trenches, roots twist through rusted metal. Nature erases the evidence of violence. But memory endures. And somewhere in the long history of the United States Marine Corps, among stories of beaches stormed and mountains taken, there remains the quieter account of a hunter who went to war and for 5 unforgettable days could not be stopped.